Can you hear me? Okay. What I'm going to do is simply offer a few remarks off the cuff, both reactions to Loïc's talk and to the situation we've seen developing. I found that following the news from France has become sort of a day job. The latest thing I've seen, for example, in reports from various newspapers is that one of the accusations is that the riots are due to Islamic polygamy practiced in the suburbs, right? And that is the entire cause of the situation.
Africa's villages being reconstituted in the banlieue.
That's right, that's right. Let me make a couple points about that. First of all, one thing that Loïc did not talk about so much is the issue of religion, and which has become a major issue. Let me cite, just for example, the latest issue of a major news source, U.S. News and World Report, which has a cover article, series of cover articles, Europe's New Agony, Why Muslims are so angry, Why Muslims are so angry, Is it Religion or Culture, and What's Next? And they talk about heavily populated Muslim suburbs in France, which, to my knowledge, do not really exist. Everybody is labeled a Muslim, even people that don't look anything like the traditional French Muslim. And it is all a matter of Muslim anger against the West. So, a couple things about that. First of all, France does have a large Muslim population. As many historians and scholars have pointed out, they are by no means uniform. They are by no means even practicing. And even though there is certainly a Muslim fundamentalist presence in France, it's by no means representative of the majority of the population. So much so that as various surveys have shown, even when the issue of the veil has come up, the issue of the right of Islamic schoolgirls to wear the chador, the veil, in public school, many Muslims in France have been opposed to this and have seen it as an importation of Islamic fundamentalism, especially those who have come from Algeria. And see this as an importation of an Algerian issue into French politics. So this is by no means a homogeneous community politically or religiously. And yet, especially in the United States, it seems, religion has become the key marker as a way of labeling these people. So the issue of religion, I think, is something that has to be dealt with. And I think a general reaction I would have to Loïc's talk is to say that I think he's absolutely right in emphasizing the role of class. At the same time, we have to look at why other people, both people in France and people outside of France are not talking about it in terms of class or talking about it in terms of race and religion. Let me make a couple of other points, and I really don't want to give a whole speech here because I want to allow plenty of time for discussion. Loïc alluded to the whole issue of the colonial past. And the issue of France's colonial past, which has been brought up by lots of foreign commentators, especially Americans who want to say, nya, 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 we don't have a colonial past, but you do, is very varied. First of all, many of these people in the banlieue are of colonial origin in one way or another. It's certainly true of North Africans. It is certainly true of many of the people from Black Africa. By the way, one group that I have yet to see mentioned, at least in any of the American reporting and hardly any of the French reporting, is people from the French Caribbean, who are normally lumped in with the so-called immigrants, even though it is very hard to be an immigrant when you're coming from a territory that has been French ever since the early 17th century, longer than certain parts of metropolitan France. And yet they're all lumped together as sort of gens de couleur immigrés. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that, very much to my dismay, there's a particular French phrase which has unfortunately jumped the Atlantic and adopted uncritically by the American press, and that is the phrase second-generation immigrant. Now, if you think about that term, it is a complete absurdity. There is no such thing as a second-generation immigrant. Either you were born in a country where you live or you are not. What that has traditionally meant is the idea that, well, you may be born in France, but because you do not fit what a French person is supposed to be, therefore you're still an immigrant. The other thing about this term, by the way, is interesting, is that demographically it doesn't really work anymore, because this is something that's really inherited from the 1980s and early 1990s. It would perhaps be more accurate now to talk about a third generation. There's a wonderful book, by the way, if you're interested in reading more about this, by a man named Paul Silverstein, an anthropologist, called Algeria and France, which talks about the rise of the third generation, the so-called, not the Beur, which was the second generation, but the so-called Rabeus, which is the inversion of Beur, just as Beur was the inversion of Arab. And these people have a very different view of France and of their place in France, as do the Beur generation. The other thing about, well, a couple of other things about France's colonial past. There has been a lot of attention recently to an incident in France's colonial / post-colonial history, because it's not really certain which one it was, And that was the demonstration that took place at the end of October, in October 1961, at the end of the Algerian War, in Paris. A demonstration mounted by the French, the National Liberation Front of Algeria, which was heavily suppressed by the police, and which resulted in the death of some 200 Algerians in the center of Paris in one night, October 17, 1961. This is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, the news of the riot was very much suppressed, and has only really come to light in the last 10 years. Secondly, it is also true that the French the police organizations to this day refuse to admit any wrongdoing, or refuse to, when there was a proposal for creating a statue honoring the dead of October 17, 1961 in Paris, they fought against it, saying that you also have to take into context the fact that the FLN was assassinating French policemen, so on and so forth. And third is another issue, which is that the demonstration that took place, in effect, was the demonstration of Algerians that lived in the banlieue coming into the center of the city on the night of October 17, 1961. It constituted a kind of invasion of the center city by the suburban population. And I highlight that because last weekend there was all this news about the French police were suspected there was going to be a similar kind of invasion of the center city. There were sort of, the sort of police units were thrown up around all the major monuments in central Paris, and there was this fear that there was going to be this kind of invasion. If you look at many different novels, films, so on and so forth, that chronicle the experience of French suburbs, especially those of Paris, you will often find this kind of invasion motif. If you look at, for example, Mathieu Kassavitz's La Haine, there's a scene where the youth of the banlieue go into the center city and are seen as very, very different, and also seen as a kind of invader. This is the historical role of the suburbs in France, the place where civilization ends, the place where the people beyond the pale, excuse the phrase, are kept. And there's a way in which these kinds of suburban areas replicate, let me say, the same kind of division between metropole and colony that existed during France's colonial empire. That in effect they are a kind of internal colony, not just because of the characteristics of their population, but also because of the role they play in French life. One of the things I really, I don't want to say enjoyed about this last few weeks, but I've really appreciated is the fact that finally people know there are kinds of things like suburbs, that Paris doesn't just stop at the Arc de Triomphe and the Tour Eiffel and stuff like that. In fact, if you look at Paris, for example, 9 million people live in Greater Paris. Only 2 million people live in the city of Paris itself. Now, this is a very varied area. Sarkozy is himself a mayor of a Paris suburb, Neuilly. But when people talk about Neuilly, Neuilly is not La Banlieue. La Banlieue is at 93, the 93 area northeast of Paris. And it represents not just a geographical space, but a social space, and an idea of exclusion from the French mainstream. Now, a couple of other points. There's also been a lot of comparisons with the contemporary situation to May of 1968, which is very interesting, because there are certain parallels. For one thing, the level of violence. Two, burning cars, for example. And I think Loïc's analysis of the whole issue of the burning car is really interesting. One of my favorite books, by the way, is a book by the literary scholar Kristen Ross, Fast Cars, Clean Bodies, which is about France during the 1950s and 1960s. She makes the argument that one of the major sort of tropes of post-war France is the car crash. And she talks about all the people like Albert Camus and others that died in car crashes. Well, if the trope of the 1950s is the car crash, maybe that of the end of the 20th century, early 21st century, is the burning car. And I think Loïc is exactly right to emphasize that this represents both a rejection of consumerism and also a frustrated participation in it at the same time. These are areas that have in many ways been colonized by not so much French industry, but by global industries. These are the areas where people wear Nike shoes. For example, where people download hip-hop songs and videos from throughout the world. Places where people are very much intertwined in the global market. Now, it has May 68 also had a relationship to consumer culture, but a very different kind of relationship. During May 68, it was a revolt of people who felt that consumerism was not enough. In the present situation is a revolt of people who feel that they are excluded from consumerism. And what is interesting is that at the same time, these are areas that are in many ways producing some of the most interesting cultural formats in France today. It is the banlieue of Paris that are the center of France's hip-hop industry. And this is, France is the second largest producer of hip-hop music and culture in the world today. Much of the most interesting theater comes out of the banlieue and speaks to these kinds of experiences. So there's a sense that, and this is something that has, often been key to the African American experience, and you now find in France these people are both economically and socially marginal, and in many ways culturally central at the same time. And I think the fact that you have them provoking this kind of crisis in a way that no other group has been able to do in the last 20 years in France really speaks to that, because now they're becoming politically central at the same time. Finally, let me speak briefly to the whole issue of U.S. comparisons. I think one of the points that Loïc made that was really important was the issue of the increasing intolerance of discrimination. There's an article, for example, in today's New York Times that talks about attempts to integrate the French TV industry. And it cites a young woman from Martinique who talks about how when she first tried to get a job in 2000, she was told, well, the French viewing public is not ready for a black TV anchor on the national news. And, had other stories as well to tell. I think what you have is an increasing belief that this is not acceptable on the part of the people that are out in the streets. By way of comparison, let me offer this. For example, about 8 or 9 years ago, Newsweek ran a special issue called "The State of Black America." It was called "The Good News About Black America," with the subtitle "Why Many Blacks Aren't Celebrating." The good news was that illegitimate births were down, unemployment was down, there was a rising black middle class, there was integration into upper echelons of American industry, so on and so forth. So the question was, well, why weren't blacks celebrating? And because the bad news was that progress had been made, but the goal of equality had not been achieved. And in fact, the article made the very trenchant point that if you took the same statistics and made them statistics about white America, America generally will see itself as in a major state of crisis. That this would not be acceptable for the dominant population, but it was seen as progress for a subordinate group. I think you have a similar kind of situation in the French banlieue. People may see them as, in many ways, having progressed, but what these people want is equality with the French because they are French, and they insist on that fact. There was a German sociologist a generation ago who wrote a book about the Social Democratic Party and developed the theme of negative integration. In other words, people are integrated into society in a conflictual manner. By the method of trade unions, the Social Democratic Party, socialist parties, or in this case, by taking to the streets. As many French sociologists have pointed out, you have the quote, second generation or even third generation much less willing to accept this kind of behavior because they feel that they are entitled to all the rights of Frenchmen and French women, unlike their parents and grandparents who saw themselves first and foremost as immigrants and therefore grateful to be there. So I think all of those questions exist. And I think in looking at the situation now, finally I want to emphasize, as Loïc pointed out, what you're looking at is a kind of endemic ritualized violence. People have pointed out that on every New Year's Eve in France, something like 400 cars go up in flames. Something like 9,000 cars have been burned from the beginning of this year until the outbreak of the riots on October 27th. It reminds me of a situation that used to exist in Detroit called Devil's Night, where every Halloween you would have lots of fires started throughout the city. And nobody called it a riot because it happened every Halloween. But in effect it was a ritualized kind of, quote, letting off steam, a ritualized kind of expression of anger that could not find outlet in any other kind of manner. So I think that's one way of saying that, yes, the story is not over, because I think after the TV cameras go home, you will still have burning cars in the banlieue. And the only difference will be that people will return to the idea that the banlieue is really not a place you have to visit. It is not really a place that counts in French society, but hopefully that will change.
So now we have time for questions, and I will take the microphone so you can ask.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I wanted to point out also to another kind of incident also which occurred in France, but in the overseas department of Martinique. In 1959, there was a similar riot, as a result of a white gendarme, a French gendarme, riding a motorcycle. There was a death of a Martinican man, and that caused, riots for I think a few days. And there were a few deaths and many injured. And scholars have said that part of the reason why these riots occurred was because Antilleans were at the time felt like they didn't have any kind of agency at home. They felt like there was some kind of continuing colonial relations in the Antilles. Since then, they've gained more agency, I think, on the local level, at least politically speaking. And there has been there haven't been any kind of rioting, but yet you have at least 25 to 30% unemployment rate. So my comment is more so that I believe that these riots or these events are more so related to kind of a process or an environment that make certain people of African descent, of Antillean descent, of Arab descent, feel like they're not at home, although they are at home. So I think part of it, most of it, is related to that. And also I have a question, which is related to, in fact, gender. I was wondering, what is the gender dimension of these events? And what does it mean? If are women participating? Are women of African descent, Arab descent? Are they participating? And what does it mean?
First, until we have better data, we're all in a sense speculating. But the early arrest data suggests that the participants are overwhelmingly men, overwhelmingly young men, mostly ages 13 to 20, and also that they are very mixed. I think it's not a correct characterization to say they're mostly men of African descent. So they are really very mixed, like the neighborhoods from which they come. There's only about 5% foreigners in the early count of the arrestees, and the announcement after the announcement of Sarkozy that he would expel the foreigners, even if they had legal papers and so on, they would be expelled, which then of course turned out that it's not even possible administratively, and you would violate the European Convention, and you have recourses, and the administrative court will not allow it. But it's good announcement to make on TV to say that every foreigner who was caught in a riot will be expelled immediately. But in reality, out of the some 3,000 arrested, only about 5% are foreigners, which is less than the percent, and there's about 7% foreigners in France. So the representation of the foreigners is less among the rioters than it is, largely because this is a homegrown population. And the typical riot in the 1990s, as today, so far as we are able to determine, is really mixed black blanc beurre, with the black kids, Arab, kids of Arab descent and kids of African descent, mixed. And the women, it's interesting, the women are not participants in the riots, but they're, insofar as we can judge from interviews and from press accounts and from a variety of accounts you can get from friends who go into the neighborhood and tell you, they are quietly supportive of the events. They're the typical relation, and the typical relation of many of the residents of these areas is exasperation at the youth on the one side, and exasperation at the state. So in a sense, it's a double exasperation and a double castigation that they've brought again trouble to the neighborhood. But at the same time, we know why they bring in trouble to the neighborhood, because this is a troubled neighborhood, because the state is not doing its job. And so I think you have you find this ambivalence in the attitude of the women, in particular, who support their brothers and cousins and so on, and at the same time realize that this is not all good news for the neighborhood. And again, it creates this this sort of we're on the edge of the knife. Are we going to fall to where in a sense there's going to be a recurrence of these events before the presidential election sets in, and then therefore forcing the government to actually go more to its left hand and increase social programs, education, housing, and potentially jobs programs? Or is it going to be that the recurrence of the events is going to be in a configuration such it allows the state to strengthen its right hand and to send in more police and more courts, and the criminal justice in a sense, where the strategy will be to continue to criminalize the social question, to prevent it from emerging it fully in the political stage. And I think the women from the banlieue who tend to be higher education and higher job participation, but also with a very keen sense of their entitlement, particularly to equality and to gender equality, have been, in a sense, the bearers of this ambivalence and the bearers of the very strong demand for the state to deliver the goodies.
Yeah, I read online a comment by a young woman living in the banlieue who was asked this question: what are women doing here? And she said that most women were not involved directly, but she also pointed to the fact that there were some young women, the kind of young women that hung out with guys in gangs and so on and so forth, that did take part. Very much like the men they were, the men or boys, however you want to put it, they were hanging out with. And she said, "Ce sont des filles bonhommes, quoi." They girl boys, right? So there is a certain kind of space for that as well. But I think, in general, you do have this sort of division of space. And of course, the question of gender is extremely important for these societies. I mean, there's ways in which, women have different ways of registering their discontent with these societies. But Loïc is also right to emphasize that, in many ways, much like the United States, young women in these areas are much more likely to go on to school, stay in school, go into college, have jobs, not good jobs, but have jobs, than other male counterpoints.
I wanted to add something on religion, because I think it's an important element. I had it in my notes and I skipped it, because that's been one of the dominant tropes, both in France, with, and in a sense the riots are a beautiful Horcrux test of the journalistic and political elite, of their fantasies get projected with this spate of articles about polygamy being one of the roots of the riots. It's because you have these polygamous African families where there's so many wives and so many children, and so these children are running all around, and so they're outside, and so while they're outside, then they riot. Sort of a logical. I mean, and then the two other fantasies that have been prevalent is the Islamic fantasy, which in fact is counter to the reality, first, of the weak presence of Islam in these neighborhoods. Even when they are North African population, Islam is not much of a presence. I have some statistics here to regale you, for instance, here. Among the children of Algerian and Moroccan parents who live in France today, 60% of the men declare no religion. The native French population, it's only 27% who declare no religion. So the young Algerian men and women, French people of Algerian descent, are much less likely to declare a religion. They're much less likely to practice a religion. Only 7% of them declare themselves as regularly practicing a religion. That includes all religion. 5% for the men, 6% for the women. Well, that's the respect for Ramadan and the food taboos associated with Islam, which are much more prevalent, are a way of marking respect for their parents, respect for the tradition from which they come. But they have very little. They are very shallow in terms of religious meaning. They mean more fidelity to the culture and origins of the parents, and they really have not much religious meaning, and certainly no fundamentalist meaning. Religion remains restricted to the private sphere, and more importantly, where there has been a Muslim presence, it has acted as a damper to the violence, because the Muslim groups that are present in some neighborhoods are instillers of discipline and respect for authority, and their role has been to actually go on the in front of the youth and try to draw them away from their confrontation with the police. So in a sense, if you were in the logic of looking at the role of Islam, you should hail the Islamic presence for having reduced the virulence of the violence, and you should hail the role of religion as a form of social control. But the fantasy of the civilizational clash of the West versus Islam takes over and leads people to invent sort of a brewing Islamic presence that would act as an extra dynamite when really it's the complete opposite.
It's the fantasy of Al Qaeda in the banlieue.
Yeah, which was there during the first the first Gulf War. There was the widespread fear, among the political elites. Again, their isolation from the reality of the banlieue. There, was the root of that. When you have never set foot in these neighborhoods, you can imagine all kinds of things. And when your knowledge from these neighborhoods comes from reading the press, which also doesn't go in these neighborhoods much, since the wave of riots of the late 80s and early 90s, because the youth are, in a sense, castigated, are vilified in these press accounts, and so they don't want journalists, and they have a very rough attitude towards the journalists. If you come in with a TV camera and so on, you will get beat up and your TV camera broken, because they are tired of this discourse of of demonization. And so the press therefore has less knowledge of this banlieue today than it did 10 years ago, and the journalist whose knowledge of the country comes largely from reading the press, in a sense, he's even more removed. Therefore, that creates the conditions under which they can have this sort of wild flights of fancy that are, again, revealing of the degree of isolation and self-enclosure of the political and the media elite as well. And the media, how do they operate when an event like that happens and they don't know, what is really going on? They look at what are the other journalists writing, and as soon as one journalist writes about, well, it's about ethnicity and it's about race and it's about immigration, right? Because that's all that these banlieues are about. And one starts this and everybody else says, keys their report on what the other has said. And so suddenly you have this sort of bandwagon effect where the only interpretation, and they all see, and they all are absolutely convinced that their interpretation is correct because all of their colleagues are giving the same interpretation. Yeah, but that's because the press doesn't go in the banlieue to talk to the people in the banlieue. They read the press. And they watch TV, and then so you have a circular reinforcement of this, ethnic reading that then when they go into the banlieue, well, they're not welcome with open arms, and they have difficulty establishing rapport and talking to the youth of the banlieue, and therefore knowing the reality. So this ethnic demonization, the centering around immigration, creates the condition under which they are less likely to go and more likely to be rejected when they do go, and so their ignorance increases and justifies their continued, interpretation in that fashion.
Okay, I have a question. Yes,
I also wanted to follow up on the topic of the campaign as Muslims not being well integrated and Islamist fundamentalists being responsible for these riots, because you both talked about this kind of label that came up in the media campaign and how it is addressed by politicians. But in fact, I read an interview with this was a representative of a neighborhood organization from Saint-Denis, and he was saying that on the other side, and I don't know if that's true, but he was saying that a lot of people who are not Muslims, obviously, but live there, feel also labeled and targeted when this discourse is aiming at them. At that, in the banlieues, often it's almost like kind of like a negative sort of collective identity now, and it's perceived like almost like synonymously as excluded working class, and that it brings this dynamic factor in of not just rejecting, or we're not Muslims. It's not a ghost. It's a ghost discourse, but it brings in like some sort of positive identification. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've heard about that or if you want to comment that.
Just a couple comments. I mean, I think it makes sense because this is why you have this U.S. News and World Report area that says the entire suburban area of France is just basically Muslim. Or my wife has done research on crime and black life in LA, which points out that whenever a black person is involved in a crime in LA, no matter where in LA, it's usually referred to as an incident in South Central LA. So it could take place in Beverly Hills or whatever, but because it involves somebody black, it's targeted as in a territorial kind of manner. And I think the same thing is happening in the banlieue in France. I mean, for example, the fact that there's been virtually no reporting on what I think is really true, that there are lots of, quote, regular European descent French people involved in these riots as well, speaks to that, because I think in a lot of ways people feel that it doesn't make any difference. They are all part of this sort of, quote, religiously defined or post-colonial underclass. And the fact that they live in these areas, even though in many cases the majority of these areas are, people of European descent, is not seen as really seen as what really counts. And that's again what I was trying to get at when I was really emphasizing the idea of the suburbs as sort of outside civilization, as a sort of, noose of poor people that's threatening to strangle the cities, and when you add the whole issue of Islam into the mix, there again you have Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations in urban space. Let me just make another point, which is that in talking to friends in Paris and other parts of France over the last 2 weeks, I've been struck by the fact that, for example, people that live inside Paris know nothing about what's going on in the banlieue. They've never been there, they don't have a sense of it, it doesn't affect their daily lives whatsoever. And so the isolation within these metropolitan areas is really striking.
Let me add something to the representation of the banlieue as this sort of uncivilized wilderness. Because it's really interesting that it's not, which then gets, in a sense, confused and conflated with the question of post-colonial presence and immigration. Because when these banlieues were represented as overwhelmingly working-class territories, they were also represented as uncivilized.
Absolutely.
And the working class was represented as this internal other. And so, the idea that suddenly this comes from the new kind of population that exists in the banlieue, it's just not true. If you read the accounts of, and also the talk of the ghetto, which the journalists are convinced this is new phenomenon. There's a book recently published by a French economist called Morin, Le Ghetto Français, that was propped up by Le Monde as this must-read book that tells you the truth about France and this new novel phenomenon. And basically it calls, ghetto an area of poverty. Well, there's been poverty for a long time. We can go back to, the medieval times but what was interesting is that this was supposed to be novel, but you read the accounts of the portrayal of La Courneuve or Bobigny from the 1970s and the 1960s, the same. The wilderness, the ghetto, so the same discourse of, the same othering impulse. And so when people, when there are people of color, it's a little easier because you can sort of, in a sense, you can bring in all of the colonial, unconscious. But the othering goes on and is just as, in a sense, essentializing when it concerns the working class as when it concerns, ethnically marked population. The other thing I want to remark is the semantic drift that has occurred, even in the terminology used to designate these issues and these realities. It used to be when the first riots from the 80s came out, then people talked about banlieue ouvrière, banlieue difficile, and then gradually it became banlieue. Now, banlieue technically means an area ringing around the city. So it could be a very wealthy area, and it used to be, people used the term banlieue to say, when you said banlieue 15 years ago, you didn't know if you meant the rich suburb of Neuilly, where Sarkozy is mayor, or the poor suburbs of Évry and Bobigny and so on. But now there's been a complete drift where banlieue means only the lower class declining, and in the collective imagination, immigrant, Islamic. Worse than that, the term quartier, which means neighborhood. It used to be, you talked about quartier ouvrier, quartier en déclin, quartier des banlieues, the neighborhood of the banlieue. Then there was a drift to quartier sensible, sensitive neighborhood, which was the official state designation to name the territories that would be the object of special urban renewal programs and so on and so forth. Basically, try to give an urban solution to a social question, which of course it didn't work. So when it didn't work, you rename them, and every 5 years there's a new program. I mean, the cacophony that is urban policy in France is absolutely astounding. Every 3 to 5 years, all the names change, all the neighborhoods get renamed, all the programs are uprooted, get started from scratch, and you add more layers. It's like a millefeuille. You have more layers and layers and layers, and then people in the neighborhood don't understand what's going on. The local authorities don't understand, and the politicians don't understand. But they've put another millefeuille, another layer to protect themselves from facing the reality. That's really basically the function of the urban policy. But then there was a drift to quartier sensible, to simply quartier. Well, now when you say quartier and you listen to the French news or read in the newspaper, when people say quartier, neighborhood, they mean only declining lower class neighborhood that is a problem territory holding a problem population. You can't say, if you say, I live in a quartier, I live in a neighborhood. Where doesn't everybody live in a neighborhood? No, that means I live in a bad neighborhood. So it's really remarkable how the whole urban language has been recoded to refer strictly solely to these particular territories and population. And in the reporting, there's been also a remarkable speed. Now, this is an impression from watching the news, which you can watch on the web. You can watch both Antenne 2 and TF1, so you can watch the news every night. It's been very time-consuming the last 3 weeks, because I don't have the time to watch all the news. But a preliminary analysis, again, this is not, I haven't done the hard data and so on. And again, all of this is provisional, because nobody has the hard data to really, sort of fully prove a point. Except that I think we have a job to do to prevent the existing pre-coded interpretation to taking such a hold that you can't even analyze the problem afterwards. But my sense from watching the news is that whenever there have been pictures of the rioters, they have entailed, a fair amount of colored faces. And whenever there have been people in the neighborhoods that have been the victim of the violence, and people who are protesting, very strangely, they have been overwhelmingly white, which suggests, well, there is a strong white presence in the neighborhood. Now, again, the split, it would be interesting to see if the split comes from the journalists, in a sense, that's the framework within which they enter the neighborhood, or that's how they're able to recruit people, or that those are the people who will let themselves be interviewed, and so on and so forth. But it's very striking that at minimum, there's a very strong white presence in those neighborhoods, since every time there's somebody to protest the riots inside the neighborhood, it's an overwhelmingly the white presence. So clearly the neighborhoods are a little more mixed than the other side of the coverage gives us, the impression of.
Okay, I have 3 questions, and I suggest, because of the time constraint, that they just together, okay?
I'll try to say this quickly. I think the most disturbing thing that you've both developed is the complete Americanization of the entire French policy construction and political construction in response. And I think it's important to say Americanization, not just neoliberal, because of the specific lack of any intermediate representation, organized representation from within France, and this presidentialization effect that I really appreciate you brought out as being what has dominated political definition in this country increasingly for decades. So someone who works on American policies myself is very disheartened to hear that I would have expected French politics to have a little more capacity, even despite the neoliberal. So to me, the missing part of both of this conversation is why there was no counterforce to this kind of globalization and no ability to articulate the real communities and the real points. And my final point, I think I so appreciate you bringing up the change in the instruments of incorporation. Instead of integration or not, finally you've raised different sectors of incorporation, which I think is always missing from this discussion.
We're going to do all the questions.
Thank you very much for your persuasive analysis. I think the focus on social issues is very much welcome. And in this respect, I wanted to ask you a question, and that's regarding the labor market. And neoliberal economists often refer to a sort of a dual labor market. On the one hand, those who are inside and who are well protected, particularly in France, under labor protection, and that they can't be fired so easily as they can, for example, in the US, and so on. And neoliberal economists then often argue that this actually makes jobs that are sort of the interim jobs more precarious and so on. And they therefore argue that labor protection should be reduced and so on in order to have more growth and therefore employment. And I mean, this strikes me as a very much an ideological discourse, but at the same time I would like to know how you would respond to this kind of argument, because at the root analysis of the cause of the riots would be congruent with yours, I suppose.
Before I give you the mic, I just would like to point out that you came up with a very good point, and I think it should be the discussion of a second panel. Is why don't you have more riots in the US?
my question is a two-point question. Basically, Professor Wacquant, you underscored the question of the autonomization of the political system. And the point itself of the political system in France since essentially the Second World War has been automizing the elite from the people. And you could say that the way that the French economy and the French political economy was developed and what it was essentially isolating the énarque from essentially the peasants and then from mass society in general. And what you could be in the same time, you're saying that you're seeing as a basic dysfunction in the way the economy as a whole works, from which this specific people are being excluded especially. And what many commentators are saying about the French political economy in general, it is that essentially what you're saying, that the French model in itself and the French state model in itself has come to a point in which, specifically for the autonomization of the state, for the autonomization of the elite, has very few possibilities of change and very few places to go. So where, if anywhere, could the reform of in the end, in your terms, the French political economy could go to solve, in the end, a problem which is, in this case, just a symptom of a greater malaise? And the second question, and something we're really seeing in Europe in quite a bit is this, the people in general from the unatomized state, and which are themselves disorganized or individualized in a very strong sense, in the front of an effacement, essentially in a very rapid way going against the center. And this has happened in Spain, this has happened and it happens all the time in France, either in this way or by other forms of organization. And my question would be, again, what type of social response, which is in the end different than this, could arise from this general dynamic?
I'll try to answer the three questions as a package, because I think they are linked. First, I think the institutional changes introduced by the recent constitutional reform that went from a presidency of 7 years that has its own temporality to a presidency of 5 years that has the same temporality of the congressional election has really changed has accelerated the incipient presidentialization of the French political system, which was already pushed by the forces of marketing, political marketing, of the role of the media, and so on. I think it's been very key. It's been very key because the fact that this is Act 1 of the presidential campaign of 2007, in a sense, pretty much, very much limits the kind of policy response that is possible. The fact that the Socialist Party is paralyzed right now with its own internal fights, and I think there's an enormous responsibility in all of this. This goes back to your question. So I think looking at the structure of the political system and its working is one element. Looking at the way this has also facilitated the importation of American-style solutions to the management of social problems, in particular, in a sense, the penalization of poverty as a strategy for managing the poor. That's the topic of my book, Punishing the Poor, coming out next year in English with Duke University Press, in which I invite the Europeans to return and to look at the invention of this policy in the US, because this is the policy that is coming, at a neighborhood, at a lower class neighborhood near you. And so, if you want to know, what its roots are and what its dilemmas and what its implications are, in a sense, study them where they've been invented. The change in the instruments of incorporation, I think it is important, in a sense, to call the misinterpretation of the sort of the rosy mythology of Republican integration, which there's in particular a book that's available in English that I strongly recommend is Gérard Noiriel, The French Melting Pot, that analyzes the process whereby waves, France for a long time until very recently thought of itself as not a country of immigration, as a very old nation formed in the 12th century, but in reality it is a country of immigration. In fact, it's been more of a country of immigration than the US. If you look at the percentage of immigrants relative to the native population between 1880 and 1910, which is the peak of US immigration and during the era of industrial urbanization, France received more immigrants per capita than the US did. But France construed itself as this homogeneous population, that didn't have ethnic differences. In fact, there have always been strong ethnic differences, in particular regional differences. But these were, in a sense, overwhelmed by the late and powerful forms of, in particular forms of class formation. And it's, in a sense, the unmaking of the traditional French working class and the new modalities of emerging of a new urban proletariat that now, creates a situation where the traditional mode of incorporation is no longer there. And suddenly France finds that it has to live up to its so-called integration model. Then the second mistake is that then people typically interpret that incorporation of immigrants is not working. And I think all indicators show that, in fact, it is working, and that's why there is the conflict. And that's why Le Pen has a market. Otherwise, how would he have said something? If the immigrants continue to be marginalized and excluded, then why would anybody worry about them? And what would Le Pen be selling? And what would Sarkozy be selling? Because Sarkozy, is trying to get the Le Pen voters and to basically attach them to his coattails now, so that later in the campaign he can then try to, get the center-right voters. Of course, the dilemma is how many of the center-right voters is he going to get after the position that he's taken? So, this is yet to be seen. Last, I would make a distinction between the state and the political field. I'm using Bourdieu's concept of the bureaucratic field on the one side as the set of public institutions that manage and that claim monopoly over the manipulation of the distribution of public goods, public bureaucracies, if you wish, the state independent of the political personnel and the time and days and parties and so on, and then the political field as in particular, parliament, organizations, and the political system with the parties. And I think that the political field, in Bourdieu's sense of the term, is a space of contention and representation that is structurally heteronomous. It has to be rooted, it has to be grounded in social space. And the political actors have to be tied, have to have an organic relationship to the collectives which they both fabricate and represent. What has happened in the recent period, in my view, is that the political, but it has to have enough autonomy for political work to be effective. What has happened, in my view, lastly, it has to do with both the bureaucratic field that has been recomposed, and in particular where the left hand of the state, the hand of the social work, and so on, has been weakened relative to the right hand, particularly the hand of the police, criminal justice apparatus, as a means of controlling these populations. And secondly, there's been a change in the political field itself with a pathological degree of autonomy. In a sense, you could say, as I said earlier, the critique of the U.S. political system is that it's not autonomous enough. It's basically, sadly, it's become the caricatural, executive committee of the ruling class. But in France, it's not the executive committee of the ruling class, but it's become too much of a game, where the politicians are only oriented towards themselves, as opposed to being oriented towards their constituents. And so I think it is this pathological, excessive autonomization of the political field, closing onto itself and latching onto the media field. When one would need to do a broader analysis of the transformation of the field of journalism, particularly under the privatization of televisions and the growing pressure towards marketing-oriented reporting and so on and so forth. And it's basically latched. The politicians are oriented to the media, and the media are oriented to the politicians, and they speak only to each other. And who's forgotten? The rest of the country. And I think so. The excessive marketization, the excessive de-autonomization of the media field, and the excessive autonomization of the political field creates a situation where it's very hard for the political elites to come up to even think of a viable solution because they don't even have the right diagnosis. And here I'll close with that. The ultimate responsibility is actors that are not crucially involved in the current debate, we should be, is the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party bears an overwhelming responsibility in first having reformed, having gone along with the reform of the Constitution, creating the 5-year presidency, having inverted the calendar of congressional and presidential election, making the presidential election the pivotal political moment in all of French political life, and being so concerned with their own, internal jockeying that they've lost all connection to the working classes which they are supposed to represent. And their strategy of orienting themselves only to the cultural bourgeoisie is turning out to be, their death knell.
Let me just make one very quick point about this. As bad as the situation that Luke has described is, at least you do have some sort of relationship between these events and the political system in France. By way of comparison,